The tribunal chamber smelled of processed air and fear. Olin stood in the judgment cage, his wrists bound with neural restraints that sent small jolts of electricity through his nervous system whenever he moved. The cage itself was a simple construction of black metal bars that rose from floor to ceiling in the center of an otherwise empty room. Around him, at elevated desks arranged in a semicircle, sat 5 judges whose faces he could barely see in the dim lighting. They wore the gray robes of the administratum, their features hidden behind breathing masks that filtered out the contamination of the accused. He had been standing there for 6 hours. The restraints prevented him from sitting or even shifting his weight comfortably. His legs burned with fatigue, but every time he tried to adjust his stance, the neural shock reminded him that stillness was his only option. Behind the judges, servo skulls floated in lazy patterns, their mechanical eyes recording every moment of the proceedings for the archives that stretched back 10,000 years of imperial justice. The crime was simple: data theft. The specifics were read aloud by a monotone servitor whose face had been replaced by a brass grill that produced sound through vibrations of air over metal reeds. Olin had been found in possession of a book, not just any book, but a historical text from before the current planetary governor's dynasty had assumed control. The book described different methods of governance, different ways that human societies had organized themselves in the distant past. It suggested that there were alternatives to the current system. The book had belonged to his grandfather, passed down through 3 generations of careful hiding and careful reading. Olin had never shared it with anyone. He had kept it sealed in a moisture-resistant container buried beneath the floor of his small hab unit in the lower levels of Hive Praxis. He had taken it out perhaps a dozen times in as many years, reading by the light of a small lumen when his wife and daughter were asleep. Those moments of quiet contemplation had been his only escape from the grinding monotony of his work at the nutrient processing facility. Someone had reported him. He still did not know who. Perhaps a neighbor who had seen something suspicious in his behavior. Perhaps a co-worker who had noticed the way he sometimes asked questions about how things used to be done. Perhaps even his wife, driven to protect their daughter by eliminating the source of potential contamination in their family. The Imperium encouraged such vigilance. Loyalty to the Emperor superseded all other bonds. The evidence was presented with mechanical efficiency. The book itself, sealed in a clear plasteel case to prevent further contamination. Picked captures of the hiding place in his hab unit. Testimony from 3 witnesses who confirmed his identity and his residence at the specified location. The prosecution took 11 minutes to present its case. The defense, appointed by the court and meeting him for the first time that morning, spoke for less than 2. The senior judge, Magistrate Cornelius Hake, finally looked up from his data slate. His augmented eyes glowed a faint red in the shadows of his hood. When he spoke, his voice was processed through vox grills that stripped away all traces of emotion. The accused stands convicted of data heresy in the 3rd degree, possession of prohibited materials, and thought crime against the unity of the Imperium. The evidence is conclusive. The contamination is confirmed. This court finds the accused guilty on all charges and sentences him to be rendered unto the Omnissiah for service in perpetuity. The words fell on Olin like hammer blows. He had known the verdict was inevitable from the moment the Arbites had broken down his door 3 weeks ago, but hearing it spoken aloud, in that flat mechanical voice that treated his entire life as a simple administrative matter, made it real in a way that chilled him to his core. Please. The word escaped his lips before he could stop it. The neural restraints punished him immediately, sending a spike of pain through his arms that made his vision blur. Please. I have a daughter. She is only 7 years old. My wife needs me to provide for them. I made a mistake. I will destroy the book. I will never question anything again, please. The judges did not respond. One of them made a notation on a data slate. Another consulted with a servitor that drifted close to his desk. whispering something that the recording skulls did not pick up. Magistrate Hake simply stared at Olin with those glowing red eyes for several long seconds before speaking again. The sentence is pronounced and recorded. The contamination has spread too deeply to be purged by simple re-education. Your service to the Emperor will continue, but in a form that ensures your corruption cannot spread further. Your family will receive notification of your sentence and will be evaluated for potential taint. If they are found clean, they will be permitted to continue their lives. If not, they too will serve in whatever capacity the administratum deems appropriate. 2 Arbites appeared from doorways at the back of the chamber. They wore full riot gear, their faces hidden behind polarized visors, their hands resting on shock mauls that could kill a man with a single strike. They opened the judgment cage and pulled Olin out with practiced efficiency. He did not resist. There was no point. Resistance would only make things worse for his family. As they dragged him toward the exit, he caught one last glimpse of the chamber where his life had ended. The judges were already reviewing the next case. A servo skull was recording new testimony. The machinery of imperial justice ground on without pause, processing human beings with the same clinical efficiency it applied to cargo manifests and resource allocation reports. The holding cells beneath the tribunal were crowded with the condemned. Olin was pushed into a chamber that already held 17 other prisoners, all of them awaiting transportation to whatever fate the Imperium had selected for them. Some sat quietly, their faces blank with shock or resignation. Others wept openly, their sobs echoing off the bare rockcrete walls. A few muttered prayers to the Emperor, begging for mercy that would not come. The cell was 5 meters square with a single waste reclamation unit in one corner and a water dispenser that dripped brownish liquid at irregular intervals. The prisoners had arranged themselves as best they could, trying to give each other space in the cramped conditions. But with 18 bodies packed into such a small area, privacy was impossible. Olin found a spot along the back wall and slid down to sit on the cold floor. His legs were trembling from the hours of standing in the judgment cage, and the neural restraints had left his arms weak and unresponsive. He pulled his knees up to his chest and rested his forehead against them, trying to shut out the sounds of the other prisoners' misery. Time passed in a blur. Food came at intervals that bore no relation to any normal schedule. Thin gruel dispensed through a slot in the door, to be shared among whoever was hungry enough to fight for it. Olin ate twice, forcing down the tasteless paste because some distant part of his mind still insisted on survival. But mostly he sat against the wall and thought about his daughter. Her name was Mira. She had been born during a rare moment of leave from his work shift, and he had held her in his arms while his wife slept, exhausted from the labor. She had looked up at him with eyes that seemed to see everything, and he had promised her silently that he would always protect her, that he would make sure she had a better life than he had known. That promise was broken now, shattered by his own foolishness in keeping that book, in indulging his curiosity about things that did not matter. He had sacrificed everything for knowledge that served no practical purpose, for ideas that changed nothing. His wife would have to work double shifts to maintain their HAB unit. Mira would grow up without a father, and he would become something that could barely be called human. The transport arrived on the 3rd day. The Arbites came through the cells, calling out names from a list and binding the selected prisoners with magnetic cuffs that locked their wrists together in front of their bodies. Olin heard his name and stood, his legs stiff from days of sitting on the cold floor. He joined the line of condemned men and women shuffling toward the exit. They were loaded into a windowless transport vehicle whose interior was divided into individual cells barely large enough to stand upright. Each prisoner was locked into their own compartment, isolated from the others. The engine rumbled to life and the vehicle began to move, navigating through the streets of the hive with stops and starts that threw the prisoners against the walls of their cells. The journey took hours, or perhaps days. In the darkness of his cell, with no way to mark the passage of time, Olin lost track of how long he stood there, swaying with the motion of the vehicle. His legs cramped, his back ached. The air grew stale and thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. But the transport ground on, carrying them toward their destination. When the vehicle finally stopped and the doors opened, the light that flooded in was orange and harsh. Olin squinted against it as the Arbites pulled him out of his cell and into a loading bay that stretched farther than he could see in either direction. The ceiling was lost in shadows high above, and the air was thick with heat and the smell of hot metal mixed with something sweet and chemical that burned his throat. The forge cathedral of St. Valerius the Cog rose before them like a mountain of sacred machinery. Its walls were built from massive blocks of blessed steel, each one inscribed with prayers to the Omnissiah in high Gothic script too small to read with unaugmented eyes. Towers reached toward the sky, their tops crowned with massive cogwheel symbols that rotated slowly, grinding against each other with sounds like thunder. Exhaust stacks belched flames and black smoke into the atmosphere, and the ground trembled with the vibration of machinery operating at scales too large for human comprehension. This was Zhao Arkad, a forge world of the Adeptus Mechanicus where the production of war materials took precedence over all other concerns. The entire planet was covered in factories and refineries, forges and foundries, all of them working without pause to supply the Imperial war machine with the equipment it needed to fight on 10,000 fronts across the galaxy. The native population numbered in the hundreds of billions, but most of them were servitors, their humanity stripped away to make them more efficient tools for the Mechanicus to use. Olin and his fellow prisoners were herded into a processing center where robed tech priests examined them with scanning equipment that hummed and clicked as it recorded biometric data. Each prisoner was assigned a designation number, their name stripped away as their first step toward becoming something other than human. Olin became Subject 734, a simple numerical identifier that would follow him through the rest of his processing. They were ordered to strip, their clothes taken away to be incinerated. Olin stood naked with the others in a large chamber whose walls were lined with nozzles that sprayed them with chemical decontaminant. The liquid was cold and stung his skin, but he endured it in silence. Around him, some of the prisoners were weeping. Others stood with blank faces, already retreating into the mental shutdown that would protect them from what came next. After the decontamination, they were marked. A servitor with a branding tool burned identification codes into their flesh, starting with the left shoulder and working down the arm in rows of numbers and symbols that designated their future function. Olin felt the searing pain as the metal pressed against his skin, smelled his own flesh burning, heard the hiss of the brand cooling. The servitor worked with mechanical precision, never pausing, never showing any response to the screams of the prisoners it was marking. Finally, they were led into the conversion chamber itself. This was where Subject 734 would cease to exist as a conscious being and become Unit 734, a servitor in service to the Omnissiah. The chamber was vast and cold, despite the heat that radiated from the forge complex around it. It was divided into dozens of surgical stations, each one equipped with an operating table surrounded by articulated arms holding surgical instruments. Above each table, a complex apparatus of neural probes and auger arrays waited to perform its sacred function of mind scrubbing. Tech priests moved between the stations with the measured pace of those performing a holy ritual. They wore robes of red and black, their bodies heavily augmented with mechanical components that clicked and whirred as they walked. Some had replaced their arms with multiple mechadendrites that could manipulate tools within human precision. Others had augmented their eyes with sophisticated optical systems that could see across multiple spectrums. All of them chanted in binary as they worked, their prayers to the machine god transmitted through vox grills that had replaced their organic vocal cords. Subject 734 was strapped to a table. The restraints were made of reinforced plasteel and locked into place with mechanical precision, holding him immobile. He could move his eyes and breathe, but nothing else. A tech priest approached, this one more heavily augmented than most. His face was hidden behind a bronze mask shaped like a human skull, and his breathing was accomplished through bellows that expanded and contracted in his exposed chest cavity. Subject 734, the tech priest intoned, his voice generated by a vox system buried somewhere in his torso. You have been selected for conversion to Servitor Class Beta 7 Gamma, designation Loader Praxis 7. Your function will be the transportation of heavy materials in support of sacred manufacturing processes. Your service to the Omnissiah begins now. The tech priest made the sign of the cog, a ritual gesture that involved rotating his hand through a precise sequence of positions. Then he reached up and adjusted the neural probe apparatus, bringing it down until the array of needles and electrodes hovered just above Olin's skull. The mind scrubbing will begin with the removal of higher cognitive functions. Your capacity for abstract thought will be eliminated first, followed by your memories of personal identity and emotional connections. What remains will be sufficient to process simple commands and operate your augmented systems. But you will no longer be capable of questioning or hesitation. This is a mercy. To serve as a servitor with full awareness would be a torment beyond endurance. Olin tried to speak, to beg for mercy or at least for a quick death instead of this living erasure. But a gag had been placed in his mouth during the strapping process, and all that emerged was a muffled sound that the tech priest ignored. The neural probes began to descend. The first probe pierced his skull with a grinding sound that he felt more than heard. Pain exploded through his head, white-hot and absolute. Then a second probe, a third, a fourth. The agony built with each penetration until it became something beyond pain, a total sensory overload that caused his body to convulse against the restraints. Then the mind scrubbing began. It started in the frontal lobe, where his capacity for planning and abstract reasoning was located. Olin felt something being burned away, some essential part of himself disappearing like smoke. His thoughts became fragmented, losing their coherence. He tried to hold on to the image of his daughter, to keep her face clear in his mind, but it was slipping away. The probes moved deeper, targeting the hippocampus where his memories were stored. Each activation of the neural burner erased another piece of his past. The day of his daughter's birth disappeared. His wedding to his wife became a blur of disconnected images. His childhood, his parents, his first job at the processing facility, all of it being systematically deleted. He was aware of what was happening, but powerless to stop it. He could feel his identity dissolving, the person he had been for 33 years being reduced to corrupted data fragments. Somewhere in the remaining functional parts of his brain, he understood that this was worse than death. Death would have been an ending, a release. This was an unmaking, a transformation into something that still lived but could no longer be called human. The tech priest monitoring the process consulted a data screen, making minor adjustments to the probe settings. His mechadendrites moved with fluid grace, adjusting power levels and targeting parameters according to a pattern developed over millennia of servitor creation. He showed no emotion, no recognition that he was destroying a human soul. To him, this was simply maintenance work, the repurposing of biological material into something more useful to the mechanicus. When the mind scrubbing was complete, the probes retracted, leaving small holes in Olin's skull that would be sealed with bonding compound. What remained of his consciousness was a dim awareness, a flickering candle compared to the bright flame that had existed before. He could still perceive his surroundings, but only as raw data without context or meaning. He understood that something had been done to him, but he could no longer remember what he had lost. The surgical servitors moved in next, their cutting tools whirring to life. They worked with mechanical efficiency, following pre-programmed sequences that had been refined through thousands of conversions. Olin's arms were removed first, the cuts made with precision saws that cauterized the wounds as they worked. The organic limbs were placed in recycling containers to be processed for their useful components. The replacement arms were heavy industrial models, hydraulic lifting claws designed to grip and move objects weighing several hundred kilograms. They were bolted directly to his shoulder structure, the mounting points drilled into bone and reinforced with metal plates. Neural interface cables were threaded through his remaining nervous tissue, creating connections between his brainstem and the servos that controlled the mechanical limbs. His legs were next. The surgical servitors made their cuts just above the knee, removing the lower portions of his legs and replacing them with piston-driven mechanical units. These were designed for stability and load-bearing rather than speed or agility. Each step would be slow but powerful, capable of maintaining balance even while carrying enormous weights. The augmentation process continued for hours. His vocal cords were removed and replaced with a simple vox emitter that could only produce binary screeches for basic communication with other machines. His eyes were left organic but fitted with targeting reticles that overlaid his vision with data feeds. His internal organs were examined, and those deemed non-essential for his new function were removed to make room for power cells and coolant systems. Through all of this, the thing that had been Olin remained conscious. The mind scrubbing had removed his capacity to fully process what was happening, but some dim awareness persisted. He could feel the violations of his body, but the sensations were distant and abstract, processed through neural pathways that had been deliberately damaged to prevent the kind of psychological trauma that could interfere with servitor function. Finally, the programming phase began. A tech priest inserted a data cable directly into the port that had been installed at the base of his skull. The upload was almost instantaneous, a burst of binary code that wrote new imperatives directly into his brainstem. The instructions were simple and absolute. Identify target object, approach target object, secure target object with lifting claws, transport target object to designated location, release target object, return to start position, repeat. These commands formed a loop that would define every moment of his existence from now on. There was no room in the programming for questions or variations. No capacity for innovation or independent thought, just the endless repetition of a simple sequence of actions. Unit 734 came online for the first time. Its optical sensors activated, painting the world in overlays of data. Target acquisition runes highlighted objects that matched the size and weight parameters in its programming. Optimal pathing vectors were calculated automatically, showing the most efficient routes through the facility. Power level indicators displayed the charge status of its internal cells. The tech priest who had overseen the conversion made a final inspection, checking the seal on the cranial port and verifying that all augmentation systems were functioning within acceptable parameters. Satisfied, he marked the servitor as ready for deployment and moved on to the next table where another subject was being strapped down for processing. Unit 734 was lifted from the operating table by a heavy-duty loader servitor and carried to the charging alcoves where newly created servitors were stored until they could be assigned to their workstations. The alcove was a small chamber barely large enough to contain the servitor's bulk, with power cables that connected to ports in its back and a neural feedback system that kept it in a low-power state during its rest cycle. Time passed. Unit 734 had no way to measure it, no awareness of hours or days. It simply existed in the darkness of the alcove, its systems running diagnostic routines and waiting for activation. Sometimes it detected fragments of something that might have been memory, brief flashes of images that made no sense in the context of its current programming. A small face with dark eyes, a room with books lining the walls, the sound of laughter. But these fragments were immediately flagged as errors by its internal systems and purged before they could interfere with its function. Eventually, a signal came through the facility's communication network. Unit 734 was being activated for deployment to the Great Ingot Line in Production Sector Gamma 7. Its systems came fully online, power flowing through its augmented limbs and bringing them to full operational status. The alcove door opened, and Unit 734 walked out into its new existence. The Great Ingot Line stretched for kilometers through the heart of the Forge Cathedral, a massive assembly of smelters, presses, and cooling systems that processed raw ore into the standardized ingots used throughout the Imperium's manufacturing base. The work was continuous, operating in shifts that ran 20 hours on and 4 hours off, day after day, year after year, without pause. Unit 734 took its place among hundreds of other servitors working the line. Each one had been created for a specific function, their bodies modified to perform that function with maximum efficiency. Lifter servitors like Unit 734 transported materials between stations. Maintenance servitors tended to the machinery, replacing worn components and applying sacred oils. Quality control servitors examined finished products, their augmented sensors capable of detecting flaws invisible to organic eyes. The routine was simple and absolute. A glowing hot ingot of processed steel emerged from the smelter on a conveyor system. Unit 734's optical sensors identified it as a valid target and highlighted it with acquisition runes. The servitor approached, its piston-driven legs carrying it to the optimal position for lifting. Its hydraulic claws extended and secured the ingot, the heat-resistant coating on its mechanical fingers preventing damage from the extreme temperatures. The ingot weighed 247 kilograms. Unit 734's systems calculated the load and adjusted its posture for optimal balance. Then it began the walk to the pressing station, following the most efficient path as determined by its navigation algorithms. The journey was 312 meters and Unit 734 covered it in 4 minutes and 18 seconds, maintaining perfect balance despite the weight of its cargo. At the pressing station, Unit 734 placed the ingot on the designated platform and released its grip. The press descended with enormous force, shaping the steel into the standardized dimensions required by the Mechanicus specifications. While the pressing operation was underway, Unit 734 returned to the smelter to collect the next ingot. The cycle repeated: 20 hours of continuous work, 4 hours of recharge in the alcove, then 20 more hours of work. The routine never varied except in the minor details of which ingot was carried and which pressing station received it. Unit 734 performed this function without question, without fatigue, without any awareness that there could be anything else to existence. The heat in the facility was extreme. The smelters operated at temperatures sufficient to liquefy steel, and the radiant energy from these processes filled the entire production sector with oppressive warmth. Unit 734's remaining organic tissue was seared by this heat, the exposed flesh on its torso and face developing permanent burn scars from constant exposure. But its pain inhibitors reduced this sensation to a low-level error signal that did not interfere with its programming. The air was thick with particulates, microscopic fragments of metal and chemical compounds that would have destroyed human lungs within days. Unit 734's respiratory system had been modified to filter out the worst of these contaminants, though some damage was inevitable. The Mechanicus considered this acceptable wear and tear, no different from the degradation of any other machine component. Other servitors worked alongside Unit 734, each one a grotesque fusion of flesh and machinery. Some had been converted from criminals like Olin, their punishment taking the form of eternal servitude. Others had been created from vat-grown biological material, human tissue cultured specifically for conversion into servitors without the need to waste existing productive citizens. The Mechanicus made no distinction between these different sources. A servitor was simply a tool, and tools were evaluated only on their functional efficiency. The facility was observed by Skitarii guards whose augmented bodies made them more machine than human. They carried radium carbines and wore armor painted in the red and white of the Mechanicus, their faces hidden behind helmets equipped with sophisticated targeting systems. Their presence was not to protect the servitors, but to protect the sacred machinery from potential sabotage and to ensure that no unauthorized persons entered the production areas. Tech priests moved through the facility like red-robed ghosts, their multiple mechadendrites allowing them to perform complex maintenance tasks while reciting prayers to the Omnissiah. They saw the servitors the same way they saw the conveyor systems and pressing machines, as components in the greater mechanism of production. When a servitor malfunctioned, it was repaired if the cost was economical or recycled if replacement was cheaper. There was no sentiment involved in these calculations, only cold analysis of resource allocation. Unit 734 worked for 3 months without incident. It carried ingots from smelter to press, 312 meters each trip, hundreds of trips per shift. Thousands of ingots processed through its mechanical hands. Its systems operated within expected parameters, showing only the normal degradation that came with continuous use. In the Mechanicus productivity reports, it was listed as a fully functional asset, its performance meeting all standard benchmarks. But on the 93rd day of its service, something changed. The change began with a sound. In the rhythmic chaos of the production facility, thousands of machines operated in rough synchronization, their combined noise creating a wall of industrial thunder. But occasionally, certain sounds would align in ways that created brief moments of unexpected harmony. One such moment occurred when a massive forge hammer in a neighboring sector struck at the exact instant that a cooling vent released pressure. The combined sound was a deep, resonant clang that echoed through the entire facility. The frequency was very specific, almost identical to the bell that used to ring in the hab blocks of Hive Praxis to mark the end of work shifts. That bell had been part of Olin's life for decades, a sound so familiar that he barely noticed it consciously. But that had become woven into the fabric of his daily existence. Unit 734's auditory sensors registered the sound and processed it through the standard filtering algorithms designed to separate meaningful data from background noise. The sound was classified as environmental noise, non-functional data that could be ignored. But something else happened. Deep in the corrupted remnants of what had been Olin's brain, a fragment of memory stirred. The fragment was tiny, barely more than a ghost of an electrical impulse through damaged neural tissue. It carried no coherent information, no clear image or thought. Just a feeling, a sense of familiarity attached to that particular frequency of sound. And for exactly 0.7 seconds, Unit 734's internal chronometer stuttered. The hesitation was infinitesimal, too brief to affect its current task. The servitor continued walking toward the pressing station with its ingot, its mechanical legs maintaining their programmed rhythm. But the moment was registered by the facility's monitoring systems, which tracked the performance of every machine component in real time. The data was flagged as a minor anomaly and filed in the productivity logs. Magos Dominus Vetius reviewed these logs every week as part of his sacred duty to maintain absolute efficiency in his assigned production sector. He was a senior tech priest whose devotion to the Omnissiah had earned him the right to oversee 12,000 servitors and 3,000 human workers. His body was more machine than flesh now, his organic components reduced to a brain preserved in nutrient solutions and a few key organs necessary for biological function. Vettius believed that any deviation from optimal performance was a form of heresy against the machine god. His predecessor had been more lenient, accepting that biological components would sometimes produce minor fluctuations in productivity. But Vettius had petitioned the Forge Masters for permission to eliminate such imperfections, arguing that even the smallest irregularity represented a failure to achieve the sacred purity of function that the Omnissiah demanded. When he saw the 0.7-second hesitation in Unit 734's performance log, his optical sensors focused on the entry with mechanical precision. He cross-referenced the Servitor's creation date, its conversion records, and its performance history. Everything appeared normal except for that single moment of deviation, but one deviation could indicate the beginning of a cascade failure, and Vettius was determined to identify and correct such problems before they could spread. He flagged Unit 734 for enhanced observation and assigned a monitor servitor to record its every action in minute detail. The servitor would be watched, its performance measured against perfect efficiency, and any further deviations would trigger immediate intervention. Vettius would not allow even the smallest flaw to exist in his immaculate assembly line. Unit 734 remained unaware of this scrutiny. It continued its work cycle, carrying ingots from smelter to press with mechanical precision. But the memory fragment that had caused the hesitation remained in its damaged neural tissue, a tiny seed of corruption that the mind scrubbing had failed to completely eliminate. The weeks passed. Unit 734 worked its shifts, recharged in its alcove, and worked again. The routine was unchanging, a perfect loop of function that represented everything the Mechanicus sought to achieve in its servitors. But the monitor servitor recorded everything, building a detailed profile of performance that Vettius reviewed with obsessive attention to detail. On the 107th day, another sound alignment occurred. This time it was a hydraulic release that produced a hiss very similar to the sound of steam escaping from the nutrient processor where Olin had worked in his previous life. The memory fragment stirred again, and Unit 734's chronometer stuttered for 0.9 seconds. The deviation was noted. Vettius examined the data with growing concern. 2 incidents in close temporal proximity suggested a pattern, and patterns of malfunction were unacceptable. He scheduled Unit 734 for diagnostic examination during its next maintenance cycle. The examination took place in a service bay adjacent to the main production line. Unit 734 was directed to report to the designated location and stood motionless while tech priests connected diagnostic equipment to its cranial port. The equipment ran through standard tests, checking the integrity of its neural programming and the functionality of its augmented systems. Most of the tests came back normal. The servitor's motor functions were operating within acceptable parameters. Its power system showed appropriate levels of efficiency. Its structural integrity was rated at 87%, which was normal for a unit that had been in continuous service for over 3 months. But the neural scan revealed something unexpected. Deep in the damaged remains of its frontal lobe, there were patterns of electrical activity that should not have existed. The mind-scrubbing process was designed to eliminate all higher cognitive functions, leaving only the brainstem and basic motor control systems intact. Yet this servitor showed traces of activity in regions that should have been completely burned away. The tech priest conducting the examination brought this finding to Vettius's attention. The Magos Dominus reviewed the neural scans with his augmented optical systems, examining the data from multiple angles and comparing it against the standard templates for servitor brain function. Mnemonic spasm anomaly, he pronounced, his vox grill making the words sound like a curse. The original mind scrubbing was insufficient. Fragments of the subject's pre-conversion consciousness are persisting in corrupted form. This is causing micro-deviations in the servitor's performance as the damaged neural tissue occasionally generates random firing patterns. The examining tech priest nodded his agreement. Shall we schedule the unit for complete neural restructuring? Vettius considered this option. Complete restructuring would involve removing the servitor's brain entirely and replacing it with a cloned neural network grown in the Mechanicus biovats. The process was expensive and time-consuming, requiring the servitor to be taken offline for several weeks while the new brain was installed and programmed. No, Vettius decided. The deviations are minor and do not significantly impact productivity. Apply corrective electrical stimulation to suppress the anomalous neural activity. If the problem persists after treatment, we will consider more extensive intervention. The examining tech priest connected a neural probe to Unit 734's cranial port and activated the corrective protocols. High-voltage electricity surged through the damaged neural tissue, burning away the pathways that were generating the unwanted activity. The process took 30 seconds and caused the servitor's entire body to convulse against its restraints. When it was complete, a new neural scan showed significantly reduced activity in the problematic regions. Treatment successful, the tech priest reported. The anomalous patterns have been suppressed to negligible levels. Unit 734 was returned to active duty and resumed its work cycle, but the treatment had not eliminated the memory fragments. It had only driven them deeper into the damaged neural tissue, where they continued to exist in a dormant state, waiting for the right stimulus to activate them again. The months continued. Unit 734 carried its ingots with mechanical precision, showing no further deviations in its productivity logs. Vettius marked the case as resolved and turned his attention to other matters. The great ingot line operated at peak efficiency, processing thousands of tons of steel every day to supply the Imperium's endless hunger for war materials. But beneath the surface of that perfect efficiency, something was stirring. The memory fragments were growing stronger, feeding on each minor stimulus that resonated with Olin's lost past. A particular shade of light that reminded some buried part of his brain of the way sunlight had looked filtering through the windows of his hab unit. A vibration pattern that matched the rhythm of his daughter's laughter. These sensations were processed by neural pathways that should not have existed, building connections that the Mechanicus had tried to destroy. Unit 734 worked for a year without major incident. Its body showed the expected signs of wear. The burn scars on its organic tissue deepened. Its mechanical joints developed slight variations in their movement patterns as lubricants degraded and components settled into their operational configurations. The Mechanicus maintenance protocols addressed these issues during scheduled service intervals, replacing worn parts and applying fresh sacred oils to keep the servitor functioning within acceptable parameters. But the invisible damage continued to accumulate. Each time a memory fragment was activated, it left behind traces in the neural tissue, pathways that became slightly more defined with each repetition. The corrective electrical treatment had slowed this process but not stopped it. Somewhere in the ruins of Olin's brain, a ghost was slowly waking up. The catastrophic failure came without warning. A primary coolant conduit running along the ceiling of production sector Gamma 7 developed a stress fracture from years of thermal cycling. The fracture propagated rapidly through the metal and the conduit burst during peak operational hours, releasing thousands of liters of superheated coolant in an explosive decompression. The blast wave hit Unit 734 from above and behind, throwing the servitor forward into a support pillar. The ingot it was carrying tumbled from its grip and rolled across the floor, glowing orange with residual heat. But Unit 734 had more immediate problems. A piece of shrapnel from the shattered conduit had penetrated its backplating and damaged the primary logic processor that governed its higher-level decision-making functions. The processor was a sophisticated piece of biomechanical engineering that translated the Servitor's simple programming into the complex series of motor commands needed to perform its tasks. When it failed, Unit 734's entire control system went into emergency shutdown, leaving it frozen in place while diagnostic subroutines attempted to root around the damage. More critically, the shrapnel had also severed several connections to the pain inhibitor module. This module was essential to Servitor function, as it prevented the organic components from experiencing the full intensity of sensations that would otherwise cause psychological breakdown. With the inhibitors offline, Unit 734 suddenly felt everything. The heat from the forge became a searing agony across every exposed surface of organic tissue. The constant vibration from the machinery transformed into a bone-deep ache that resonated through its entire structure. The weight of its own augmented limbs pressed down on damaged joints with crushing force. Most horrifying of all, it could feel the violations that had been done to its body during conversion. The phantom pain of amputated limbs and the burning cold of metal bolted directly to bone. The sensory overload was catastrophic. The Servitor's neural system, designed to process only the minimal data required for its function, was suddenly flooded with millions of pain signals, all demanding immediate attention. The biomechanical brain that housed the remnants of Olin's consciousness could not process this much information through the damaged pathways that remained. Something broke. Not physically, but psychologically. The barriers that the mind-scrubbing had erected between Olin's memories and Unit 734's programming shattered under the impossible strain of the pain response. And through those broken barriers came a flood of memory. Olin's consciousness returned not as a coherent whole, but as a fragmented storm of images and emotions. He remembered his daughter's face, her small hand in his as they walked through the market districts of the hive. He remembered his wife's voice, the way she said his name with a particular inflection when she was worried about him. He remembered the book, the forbidden text that had cost him everything, and the desperate hope it had represented that there might be better ways to live. But he also perceived his current reality, the monstrous body of metal and flesh that he now inhabited. The forge facility stretching endlessly around him, filled with the screams of tortured machinery and the shuffling movements of other servitors going about their programmed tasks, the absolute lack of control over his own form as his mechanical limbs remained frozen by the damage to his logic processor. The horror of his situation was absolute and complete. He was trapped inside the machine of his own body, a ghost possessing a corpse that had been rebuilt into something obscene. He tried to scream, but his vox emitter could only produce a binary screech. He tried to move, but his limbs would not respond to his will. He was a prisoner in every sense, confined within flesh and steel that recognized his consciousness as nothing more than corrupted data. Around him, the facility had erupted into chaos. The coolant conduit failure had triggered secondary explosions as superheated liquid contacted other systems not designed to withstand such temperatures. Servitors near the blast zone had been destroyed outright, their bodies torn apart by the explosion or crushed by falling debris. Others wandered in confused circles as their programming struggled to process the sudden change in their environment. Human workers and tech priests were evacuating the immediate area, following emergency protocols developed over centuries of industrial accidents. Skitarii guards moved through the chaos with weapons ready, watching for any sign that the disaster might be the result of sabotage rather than simple mechanical failure. Above it all, alarm klaxons blared a warning that would bring repair teams rushing to contain the damage. But Olin was aware of none of this in any meaningful way. His entire consciousness was consumed by the realization of what had been done to him, what he had become, what he would remain for however long his biological components continued to function. The terror was so profound that it exceeded his capacity to process it. His mind began to fragment again, splitting into contradictory impulses that fought for control of his damaged neural pathways. One part of him wanted death, immediate and final, a release from the nightmare of his existence. Another part clung desperately to the fact that he was still conscious, still in some sense alive, and therefore still capable of hope that some rescue might be possible. A third part retreated entirely, trying to disappear back into the blessed oblivion of servitor programming where there was no awareness of suffering. Magos Dominus Vetius arrived at the disaster site wearing a sealed environment suit that protected him from the toxic fumes and extreme temperatures. His optical sensors scanned the damage with clinical precision, cataloging the destroyed equipment and calculating the cost of repairs. Production Sector Gamma 7 would be offline for at least 6 hours, while the coolant system was rebuilt and the damaged machinery was replaced. He noticed Unit 734 standing frozen among the debris, its posture indicating a system crash rather than simple shutdown. A diagnostic servitor was dispatched to investigate, rolling over to the motionless unit and extending its sensor probe to connect with the cranial port. The data that came back made Vetius pause in his damage assessment. Unit 734's logic processor was damaged but not destroyed. The pain inhibitors were offline. And most disturbing of all, the neural activity in the servitor's brain showed patterns that were completely outside normal parameters. The higher cognitive regions that should have been dead were showing intense activity, firing in complex patterns that resembled conscious thought. Vetius moved closer, his multiple mechadendrites extending to connect additional diagnostic equipment directly to the servitor's systems. He accessed Unit 734's operational logs and reviewed the recent data, noting the sudden spike in neural activity that corresponded with the moment of the explosion. The servitor's biomechanical brain was experiencing what could only be described as a catastrophic failure of the mind-scrubbing protocols. The original subject's consciousness was reasserting itself, fighting against the programming that had suppressed it for over a year. Vetius could see the conflict playing out in the neural scan data, two different patterns of brain activity competing for control of the same biological tissue. The servitor programming tried to force Unit 734 back into its work cycle, but the reawakened human consciousness was creating interference patterns that prevented the commands from being executed. From a technical standpoint, it was fascinating. Vetius had never seen a case where the mind scrubbing had failed so completely while leaving the servitor's basic systems intact. Most failures of this type resulted in complete mental collapse, reducing the servitor to a vegetative state that required immediate recycling. But this case was different. The human consciousness had somehow found a way to coexist with the servitor programming, creating a hybrid state that neither side could fully control. But from a practical standpoint, it was unacceptable. A servitor in this condition was unreliable, prone to unpredictable behavior that could compromise safety and efficiency. The unit would need to be taken offline and subjected to complete neural restructuring to eliminate the problematic organic components. Vetius made the decision without hesitation. Unit 734 is hereby classified as irreparably malfunctioning. Flag it for immediate recycling and assign a replacement from the reserve pool to maintain production quotas. The diagnostic servitor acknowledged the command and applied a restraining bolt to Unit 734's motor systems, ensuring that the damaged servitor could not move even if its logic processor came back online. Then it broadcasted a summons for a heavy-duty hauler servitor to remove the defective unit from the production floor. Inside his mechanical prison, Olin heard the sentence pronounced through his servitor's audio receptors. Recycling. The word was processed through his damaged brain, and he understood what it meant. He would be taken to the reclamation pits where failed servitors were dismantled for their useful components. His mechanical parts would be refurbished and installed in new servitors. His organic tissue would be rendered down to basic proteins for use in the biovats. Nothing would be wasted. Nothing except the consciousness that still struggled desperately for some form of expression. He tried again to move, to speak, to give any sign that he was aware and present. But his body remained frozen by the restraining bolt and the damage to his control systems. He could only wait as the hauler servitor approached, its massive mechanical arms clamping onto his shoulders with crushing force. The hauler began to drag Unit 734 toward the reclamation facility, navigating through corridors filled with the normal traffic of the Forge Cathedral. They passed maintenance crews working to repair the coolant system, tech priests chanting prayers over damaged machinery, and lines of servitors being directed to new work assignments to compensate for the production disruption. To all of them, Unit 734 was just another piece of failed equipment being removed for processing. None of them saw the consciousness trapped inside, the human soul experiencing a horror beyond anything his mind had been designed to endure. The reclamation facility occupied a sector of the Forge Cathedral dedicated to waste management and resource recovery. Here, everything that could not be repaired economically was broken down into its component parts for reuse. Failed servitors arrived in a steady stream, their bodies worn out by years of continuous labor or damaged beyond repair by industrial accidents. The processing was highly automated. Servitors specifically designed for dismantling work would strip away the mechanical components first, sorting them by type and condition. Salvageable parts went to refurbishment centers where they would be cleaned, tested, and prepared for installation in new units. Damaged components beyond repair were sent to recycling furnaces where they would be melted down to raw materials. The organic components received different treatment. Biological tissue that was still functional might be harvested for transplant into servitors that needed replacement parts. Brain tissue was never reused due to the risk of memory contamination, but other organs could serve well enough if properly sterilized and prepared. What could not be salvaged was rendered in chemical baths, breaking down complex organic molecules into simple proteins and nutrients that fed the biovats where new servitor components were grown. Nothing was wasted. The Mechanicus had perfected these processes over 10,000 years, developing procedures that extracted maximum value from every gram of material that entered the reclamation facility. It was efficiency taken to its logical extreme, a perfect closed loop where even failure served a purpose in the greater mechanism of production. The hauler servitor brought Unit 734 to a holding area where failed servitors waited their turn for processing. The space was crowded with damaged machines in various states of deterioration. Some had lost limbs in industrial accidents. Others showed signs of mechanical failure, their augmented systems seized up or burned out. A few, like Unit 734, appeared physically intact but were being recycled for software failures that made them unsuitable for continued service. They stood or lay in their assigned positions, those that were still capable of independent power maintaining their systems in low-energy mode while they waited. Those that had been completely shut down were propped against walls or stacked like cordwood, their mechanical components already showing signs of rust and degradation from lack of maintenance. Olin could perceive all of this through Unit 734's optical sensors. He saw the other servitors, recognized in their ruined forms a mirror of his own condition. Each one had once been human. Each one had been unmade and rebuilt according to the needs of the Mechanicus. And now they were being unmade again, reduced to spare parts and raw materials. The wait stretched on. Time was measured in the slow rotation of work shifts, the changing of the guard among the Skitari who watched over the holding area, the gradual filling of the space as more failed servitors arrived to join the queue for recycling. Olin counted each passing hour by the changes in the facility's lighting, the artificial day-night cycle maintained to support the human workers who needed regular rest periods. During this time, he fought desperately against his programming, trying to reassert control over his mechanical body. But the restraining bolt was absolute. and his damaged logic processor could not generate the motor commands necessary to overcome it. He was a passenger in his own flesh, capable of perception but not action. On the third day of his wait, a new group of prisoners arrived at the reclamation facility. They were being transported to the conversion chambers for processing into servitors, their journey taking them past the holding area where the failed units awaited destruction. Olin saw them through Unit 734's optical sensors, recognized in their faces the same terror he had felt when he made this walk over a year ago. They were shackled together in a line, 50 men and women whose crimes had condemned them to this fate. Some walked with their heads down, already retreating into the mental shutdown that would protect them from what was coming. Others looked around desperately, searching for some avenue of escape that did not exist. A few wept openly, their faces contorted with grief for the lives they were losing. Olin saw them and understood that he was witnessing the continuation of the cycle that had claimed him. These people would be unmade just as he had been unmade. They would serve for months or years or decades, depending on how long their biological components held out. And when they finally failed, they too would be brought here to be recycled. The injustice of it burned in what remained of his consciousness. These people had committed crimes, but did any crime truly deserve this punishment? To be stripped of identity and free will, to be transformed into a living tool and used until the body broke down, to be denied even the mercy of death because the mechanicus could find use for every fragment of biological material. He tried to scream, to warn them, to tell them what awaited them in the conversion chambers. But his vox emitter remained silent, locked down by the restraining bolt. He could only watch as they were led away, their footsteps echoing in the corridor long after they had disappeared from view. Something crystallized in Olin's damaged consciousness, a desperate need to communicate, to make some mark on the world that proved he was still present, still aware, still human despite everything that had been done to him. The programming that governed his servitor body was absolute, and the restraining bolt prevented any motor functions. But there was one system that was not completely locked down, one component that retained a tiny margin of operational flexibility: the vox emitter. It had been installed to allow basic binary communication with other machines, simple screeches and tones that conveyed status information according to standardized protocols. The restraining bolt prevented it from being used for its intended purpose. But there was a narrow range of sounds that fell outside the bolt's control parameters. Sounds that served no functional purpose in servitor operations, and were therefore not restricted. Olin focused every fragment of his remaining will on that one system. He accessed the vox emitter through neural pathways that had been damaged by the mind scrubbing but not completely destroyed. He tried to force sounds through it, not the binary screeches of machine language, but something else, something that would be recognized as human. The effort was immense. His consciousness was fragmented, his control over the servitor body minimal. The vox emitter resisted his commands, defaulting to its programmed behavior. But he kept trying, pouring everything that remained of Olin into this one desperate attempt at communication. A sound emerged from the servitor's vox grill, not words. Olin no longer had the capability to form words through the mechanical system, but it was distinctly organic in its quality, a soft exhalation that carried the harmonics of human breath rather than the pure tones of machine-generated audio. It lasted only a fraction of a second before the vox emitter's safety protocols suppressed it. But it had happened. Olin had managed to create a human sound, to send a signal that he still existed inside this mechanical shell. The effort exhausted what little control he had managed to establish, and his consciousness retreated back into the depths of his damaged brain. But the act had been accomplished. The next morning, the processing of the holding area began. A work crew of dismantling servitors arrived and began selecting units for recycling according to the priority rankings assigned by the facility's management systems. Unit 734 was flagged as low priority, its mechanical components all functional and therefore valuable enough to warrant careful dismantling rather than immediate destruction. The hauler servitor that had brought Olin to the holding area returned to collect him. It clamped its mechanical arms around Unit 734's torso and lifted the frozen servitor from its waiting position. The journey to the reclamation pits was short, just a few corridors away from the holding area. The pits themselves were vast chambers cut into the bedrock beneath the forged cathedral. Each pit was filled with molten metal, the recycling furnaces maintaining temperatures sufficient to reduce any material to its liquid state. Above the pits, massive gantries held chains and hooks for positioning materials before they were dropped into the consuming fire below. A new group of prisoners was being brought through the facility at that moment, another line of condemned humans being led to the conversion chambers. They were following the same route that Olin's hauler servitor was taking, their paths converging in a corridor that ran parallel to the reclamation pits. One of the prisoners, a man in his 30s with the calloused hands of a factory worker, heard something that made him pause. A sound from one of the servitors being transported to the pits, a sound that was distinctly wrong for a machine to make. It was soft and mournful, barely audible over the ambient noise of the facility. A sob. The man turned his head to look at the servitor being dragged past him. It was a massive unit, its body heavily augmented with industrial equipment. Its optical sensors were active, the targeting reticles glowing faintly in its mechanical eyes. For just a moment, those eyes met his, and the man saw something in them that machines should not possess. Awareness, suffering, humanity. Before he could process what he had seen, a tech priest supervising the prisoner transport struck him across the shoulders with a power maul. The electric shock drove him to his knees, and the priest's vox grill barked a command. Keep moving. Do not delay the processing schedule. The man stumbled back to his feet and rejoined the line, his mind reeling from what he had glimpsed. The other prisoners pushed him along, and the moment passed. The servitor was dragged away toward the reclamation pits, and the prisoners continued their march toward the conversion chambers. Magos Dominus Vetius was observing the reclamation process from a gantry overlooking the pits. He had come to verify that Unit 734's recycling was being carried out according to proper procedures. The servitor had represented an interesting case study in neural failure patterns, and he wanted to ensure that its brain tissue was properly cataloged before destruction, so that the data could be analyzed for future improvements to the mind-scrubbing protocols. His optical sensors tracked Unit 734 as the hauler servitor positioned it on the gantry above the molten metal. The servitor was still frozen by the restraining bolt, its body hanging limp in the hauler's grip. But Vetius's sophisticated sensors detected something unusual, a momentary fluctuation in the servitor's vox emitter output, a brief audio signal that did not match any standard machine communication protocol. He accessed his data slate and reviewed the sensor logs, isolating the anomalous signal and analyzing its frequency patterns. The sound had been organic in nature, generated by forcing air through the vox grill in a way that mimicked biological vocalization. It served no functional purpose and represented a waste of the servitor's limited power reserves. Vetius made a notation on his data slate. Unit 734 produced anomalous audio output prior to decommissioning. Potential flaw in vox emitter design. Recommend reinforcing lockdown protocols to prevent wasteful energy expenditure on non-functional vocalizations. The notation was filed in the appropriate database, where it would be reviewed by other tech priests responsible for servitor design optimization. It represented the sum total of official recognition that Olin's final desperate act would receive, a technical anomaly to be corrected in future models. The hauler Servitor released its grip and Unit 734 fell into the reclamation pit. The molten metal was hot enough to vaporize organic tissue instantly and liquefy even the most resilient mechanical components within seconds. There was no time for pain, no extended suffering. Just a moment of extreme heat and then nothing. The consciousness that had been Olin ceased to exist. The memories of his daughter, his wife, his former life, all of it was destroyed as the biological tissue that housed them was reduced to constituent atoms. The mechanical components that had been bolted to his body melted into the general mass of recycled metal that would be refined and reused in new machines. The Forge Cathedral continued its work without pause. Production Sector Gamma 7 came back online after the coolant system was repaired. A new servitor designated Unit 734 Alpha took over the responsibilities of the failed unit, carrying ingots from smelter to press with the same mechanical precision. The productivity log showed no significant interruption. In the conversion chambers, the man who had glimpsed Olin's humanity was strapped to an operating table. Tech priests prepared their instruments and the neural probes descended toward his skull. His last conscious thought before the mind scrubbing began was of the servitor he had seen, of the impossible sound it had made, of the awareness he had perceived in its mechanical eyes. Then the probes activated, and his own unmaking began. His name was Darren Moss, and he had been convicted of organizing an unauthorized workers' meeting to discuss safety conditions in the manufactorum where he was employed. His crime was deemed severe enough to warrant conversion, and he would serve the Omnissiah in whatever capacity the Mechanicus determined. The galaxy ground on, indifferent to the suffering of individuals. Trillions of humans lived and died in service to the Imperium, their lives measured only by their utility to the vast machinery of war and production that sustained humanity's struggle for survival. Some served as soldiers, throwing their lives away in battles that determined the fate of worlds. Others served as workers, their bodies consumed by industrial processes that cared nothing for their comfort or well-being. And some served as servitors, their humanity stripped away to make them more efficient tools for the Mechanicus to use. They worked in factories and forges, on battlefields and void ships, in every corner of the Imperium where simple manual labor needed to be performed with mechanical precision. They were the invisible foundation of imperial civilization, the countless billions of lobotomized slaves whose existence was never acknowledged in the glorious tales of heroes and saints. Olin had been one among these multitudes. His story was not unique or special. Thousands of humans were converted into servitors every day across the Imperium. Millions died in the service of machines that would replace them without hesitation. His suffering, his desperate final act of communication, his ultimate destruction. None of it mattered in the vast calculus of imperial necessity, but for one moment, for the space of a single sob transmitted through a damaged vox emitter, Olin had been human again. Not a servitor, not a tool, not a resource to be allocated and consumed. A man who had loved his family, who had sought knowledge despite the risks, who had maintained his consciousness against impossible odds until the very end. That moment went unrecorded and unremembered. But it had happened. In a galaxy where humanity was measured only by its utility, where compassion was considered weakness and individual suffering was irrelevant to collective survival, one man had managed to assert his humanity one final time before the darkness claimed him forever. The forge worked on, endlessly producing the materials that would be forged into weapons and ships, armor and ammunition, all the implements of war that the Imperium required. The servitors carried their loads with mechanical precision, never questioning, never hesitating, never showing any sign of the humans they had once been. And somewhere in the ruins of a hab block in Hive Praxis, a woman named Sarah and her daughter Mira continued their lives. They had received official notification that Olin had been sentenced to service in perpetuity, and reassigned to an undisclosed Mechanicus facility. They did not know he had been converted into a servitor. They did not know he had suffered for over a year in mechanical slavery. They did not know he was dead. They remembered him as he had been, a quiet man who worked hard to provide for his family, who sometimes asked questions about things that did not concern him, who had loved them in his own reserved way. His daughter would grow up with only fragmentary memories of her father, images that would fade with time until all that remained was the knowledge that he had existed and then disappeared into the vast bureaucracy of the Imperium. Sarah would work double shifts to maintain their HAB unit, her body slowly wearing out under the strain. Eventually, she too would fail, perhaps from industrial accident, perhaps from simple exhaustion. And when she did, Mira would be alone, another orphan among the billions who populated the hive cities of the Imperium. This was the endless cycle of imperial life. Humans were born, they served, they died. Their suffering was vast and their joy fleeting. The Imperium cared nothing for their individual struggles, recognizing them only as components in the greater mechanism of survival. And yet they endured, generation after generation, carrying forward the weight of humanity's existence in a galaxy that offered no mercy and no escape. The Emperor sat in silence on the golden throne, his consciousness spread across the Imperium in ways that mortal minds could not comprehend. Perhaps he was aware of Olin's suffering. Perhaps he witnessed the countless tragedies that unfolded every moment across his domain. Or perhaps his attention was focused on threats so vast that individual human lives were beneath his notice. There was no way to know. The Emperor did not speak except through his servants who claimed to interpret his will, and his servants had determined that the conversion of criminals into servitors was a necessary practice, a way to extract utility from those who had failed in their duties as imperial citizens. So the forges continued their work, and the servitors continued their service, and the Imperium ground forward through the centuries, consuming human lives with the same mechanical efficiency that it applied to all other resources. This was the reality of the 41st millennium. This was the price of humanity's survival. This was the endless, thankless existence that awaited those who served the machine. And in the molten depths of a reclamation pit on Jau Arcade, the last physical traces of a man named Olin merged with the recycled metal that would be forged into new machines. His atoms would be scattered and reused, becoming part of countless other objects and systems. Nothing of his identity would remain, nothing except the brief entry in Magos Vedius's data logs noting an anomalous audio signal from a malfunctioning servitor. That was all the mark he would leave on the universe, a technical note in a file that would be archived and forgotten, buried under millions of other reports and observations in the vast data repositories of the Mechanicus. Future tech priests might read it while researching Vox emitter design improvements. They would see the problem, note the recommended solution, and move on without ever wondering about the consciousness that had generated that anomalous sound. Because in the Imperium of man, individual consciousness did not matter, only function, only service, only the endless work of keeping humanity alive for one more day in a galaxy that wanted nothing more than to devour it whole. This was the truth that the Imperium was built upon. This was the horror that sustained it. This was the price that billions paid so that trillions might survive. And the galaxy ground on, indifferent and eternal, consuming lives and civilizations with equal disregard for their suffering or their aspirations. The Emperor protected, as the saying went, but his protection came in forms that were often indistinguishable from the cruelties of the enemies he defended against. The forged cathedral of St. Valerius the Cog continued its sacred work, a monument to the Omnissiah's glory and humanity's desperate struggle for survival. Its forges burned without cease, its production lines operated with mechanical precision. and its servitors labored in silent servitude until their bodies failed and they were recycled to make room for new units. This was the way it had been for 10,000 years. This was the way it would continue for 10,000 more. And in all that time, across all those billions of lives transformed into servitors, no record would show the moments of awareness that some of them experienced, the brief flickers of consciousness that persisted despite the mind scrubbing, the desperate attempts at communication that went unheard and unacknowledged. Olin's story ended as it had to end, in fire and dissolution, his existence reduced to data points and recycled materials. But for one moment he had been more than a servitor. He had been a man who refused to disappear completely into the machine, who fought to maintain some fragment of his humanity until the very end. That fight had changed nothing. The Imperium continued as it always had, grinding up lives and spitting out production quotas. But the fight had happened, and in happening, it had meaning, even if that meaning would never be recognized or understood by anyone who might have cared. This was the only victory available to those who served as servitors in the 41st millennium. Not escape, not rescue, not even the hope of being remembered. Just the knowledge, held for a few brief moments before final destruction, that they had once been human, and that some fragment of that humanity had persisted against impossible odds. It was a small victory, a meaningless victory, but it was all they had. And so the story ends as it began, with a man being unmade by the machinery of the Imperium. The screaming of the forges continues. The servitors carry their loads. The Mechanicus chants its prayers to the Omnissiah. And somewhere in the vastness of the galaxy, another prisoner is being sentenced to conversion, beginning the cycle anew. There is no peace among the stars. There is no mercy for the weak. There is only service and servitude and the endless grinding of the machine that consumes all things in its path. This is the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, and where human life is the cheapest resource in an economy measured in the blood of billions. The Emperor protects, but sometimes his protection looks remarkably like damnation.